Good morning. My name is Krista Gilliam. I'm the Women's Ministry Director here at All Souls, and I'm excited this morning to continue our sermon series of the Book of Esther. So, Kate Bowler was living a good life, a blessed life, some might say. It was 2015, and she had married her high school sweetheart. She was working at her dream job as a professor of Christian history at Duke University. She'd recently published a book on the prosperity gospel, and she'd finally gotten pregnant and delivered a healthy baby boy after years of infertility. And then, at the age of 35, when her son was 1 year old, while sitting in her office one afternoon, she got a call letting her know that the stomach pain she had gone to the doctor to check up on was actually stage 4 colon cancer, and she needed to come to the hospital immediately. She says her first thought was, I have a son. This world can't end, it's just begun. What followed were numerous treatments and surgeries and the prognosis that she would have at most 2 years to live. A few months into her treatment, she wrote about her experience in an op-ed piece for the New York Times. In it, she questioned many of her former beliefs about how health and success were a result of doing the right things and working hard. She realized that without meaning to, she had subscribed to her own version of the prosperity gospel, where good things happen to good people and bad things could be learned from or explained away. And all of this was unraveling in the face of her death sentence. She got thousands of letters after this article, mostly from people wanting to explain why she had gotten cancer. She says, people wanted me to know without a doubt that there was a hidden logic to the seeming chaos. They wanted me to reassure them that my cancer was all a part of God's plan. And she couldn't do it. She couldn't reassure them that everything would be okay, and she could not sign off on the idea that everything happens for a reason. And yet, while she was certain that she was going to die, instead of feeling angry, she felt deeply loved. Her own suffering opened her up to the suffering of others, and she felt more connected to people than she ever had before. While she was in treatment and not expected to survive, she wrote 2 New York Times best-selling memoirs, one of which is called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. After years of being told that she was incurable, she was eventually declared cancer-free. She now hosts a popular podcast called Everything Happens, about stories of suffering and happiness, success and failure. And she's gone on to write other books, including a book of blessings for imperfect days. And yet, in her TED Talk, when asked about the before or after of her diagnosis, she says, before was better. Kate Bowler's platform is interesting because she asks really hard questions and doesn't give her readers and listeners concrete answers. Why do bad things happen to good people? What do we do when our carefully constructed lives fall apart? How do we endure suffering? How do we make sense of a life that feels upside down? Where is God in my pain? And these questions are exactly what the book of Esther is getting at. We're currently on week 3 in our sermon series. And if you've listened to the previous sermons, you have heard that God is never mentioned in this entire book. No one prays, and everything that happens could be chalked up to random chance or coincidence. So that might make us question, why are we studying Esther? Is it relevant? Does it have something to teach us? What makes it worth our time and attention when we could be listening to Kate Bowler's podcast or binge watching Nobody Wants This on Netflix? Guilty. But I'd argue that not just despite these things, but because of them, the book of Esther remains relevant. It's a beautiful, complex, complicated story. And just like Kate Bowler's, it doesn't give us glib platitudes or easy answers. You have to read between the lines and look at the bigger picture in order to understand a little bit about what the author is doing, to understand the story the author is telling. And so with that, now, let's visit the scripture.
Please pray with me before we read. Creative God, creator of Eden and earth, of the past and the present, help us to honor your word today. Your scriptures teach us that you made all things and that we are your handiwork, and so we pray by your power that reading together today will help us to see you more clearly and know your love for us more deeply. Reading from Esther, chapter 2, verses 19 through chapter 3, verse 15. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem, and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the two men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all of the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or to show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the empire of Xerxes. So, in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence. The lots were called Purim, to dedicate the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There is a certain race of people scattered throughout all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they may be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." So, on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. A copy of this decree was issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion. This is the word of the Lord.
So we pick up the story in Esther with Mordecai's new job, an official position at the court. And as you heard, while he's at work one day, he overhears an assassination attempt on the king's life. He reports it to Esther, who in turn tells the king and gives Mordecai the credit. Now, acts of loyalty like this were typically rewarded immediately and generously by Persian kings. But Mordecai's reward was apparently overlooked. We find out that the act was recorded in the king's records, but no other acknowledgement of the reward is given. And this is a tiny detail that's going to have some huge significance later in the story. The very fact that he wasn't recognized at the expected moment plays a pivotal role at a later date. So just keep this in mind as we go through the book of Esther in the next few weeks. And the author does a great job of subtly pointing out this slight to Mordecai in the text. Promptly after mentioning the foiled assassination attempt, thanks to Mordecai, we get this. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted, not Mordecai, Haman. Enter the villain character. The author uses this exact moment to introduce us to Haman, and immediately as readers we're like, who is this guy and why did he get the promotion? And we aren't just given his name, but his lineage. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. And this is another small detail that's really important. When we were first introduced to Mordecai back in chapter 2, he's referred to as Mordecai, son of Jair from the tribe of Benjamin. And original readers of the text would have immediately known that someone from the tribe of Benjamin and an Agagite would be sworn enemies. We've got kind of a Montague Capulet situation here for you English majors, or we've got UGA and Alabama fans for everyone else. But basically, the author wants us to know that Haman is an enemy of the Jews. And even to this day, Haman has come to symbolize every anti-Semite that has ever tried to exterminate the Jewish people. I asked some Jewish friends of mine about their experience at Purim, the Jewish festival honoring the book of Esther, and we're going to hear more on that later. But one thing that they mentioned was that every year at Temple, when the story of Esther is written, everyone holds these noisemaker shakers called groggers, and every time Haman's name is mentioned, they hiss and boo and rattle the shakers as to blot his name out. All that to say, the author is making it abundantly clear that Haman is the bad guy in this story, and he and Mordecai have a history. So Haman gets promoted, and Mordecai doesn't. And when the official decree goes out that everyone should bow to Haman when he walks by, Mordecai refuses. And there's a lot of reasons why this happens. The author of Esther does not get into the reasons. There's a lot of theories for that. All of them are plausible. All of them have some holes. But regardless, Mordecai does not bow. And Haman is furious when he hears about this. And he decides he's not just going to take out his anger on Mordecai. He will take it out on all of the Jews throughout the empire of Xerxes. The text says this. The letters decreed that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. Haman is basically declaring open season on the Jews, and he's enlisting not just an army, but everyday people to enact this genocide. And we're talking about the mass destruction of an entire people group. This is similar to the Nazi Holocaust or the Rwandan massacre. It's no wonder that the city of Susa fell into confusion. And so to determine when this mass extermination will take place, Haman decides to cast what were called Purim or Goral, which were kind of like clay dice. And Haman's casting of the Purim, or lots, casting the lots, introduces the idea of destiny into the story because he's seeking the wisdom of lowercase gods to find a prodigious day for genocide. Haman rolls the dice. And who or what determines how they land? Is it chance, luck, coincidence, or is it in fact destiny? And if it is destiny, who is the one in charge of this destiny? Well, the Purim is cast, and the determined date is almost 12 months in the future, giving the Jews time to prepare, Esther and Mordecai time to make a plan, and the whole plot of the story time to unfold. Had the dice determined it would happen the following week, we might have a very different story on our hands. So what do you say? Destiny? Chance? God? all of this is part of the author's subtle way of making us pause and wonder, is something going on beneath the surface or behind the scenes in this story? Biblical scholar Karen Jobes says this: when we speak of God's providence, we mean that God, in some invisible and inscrutable way, governs all creatures, actions, and circumstances through the normal and the ordinary course of human life, without the intervention of the miraculous. The book of Esther is the most true-to-life biblical example of God's providence precisely because God seems absent. God seems to be absent, and the casting of the Purim seems to be random, but Proverbs 16:33 assures us that we may roll the dice, but the Lord determines how they fall. But what's even more significant than the date that the proposed genocide, what's even more significant than the date of the proposed genocide is the date that the announcement goes out. And this is another place where we have to read between the lines of the text to get this. According to the Hebrew calendar and the dates were given in Esther for when the edict is sent out, we realize that this is happening during the Jewish celebration of Passover. A quick refresher on Passover. This was and still is the holiest of holidays for the Jewish people. It's the anniversary of their greatest deliverance. It's a sacred celebration remembering how God brought them out of slavery in Egypt and how God had made a covenant that they would be his people and he would be their God. And now, in the midst of their most sacred holiday, an official proclamation is sent out declaring their annihilation. Jewish readers of Esther would have found this timing profoundly ironic. Remember, God is not mentioned once in this text, and that is on purpose. This is the very heart of the questions that the book of Esther asks, questions that are still relevant to this day. Will God still save God's chosen people? Is God near even when we don't feel God's presence? Where is God when everything seems up to chance? Is God in control, or is everything random? When the deck seems stacked against the good and the true and the beautiful, how do we continue to trust? Barbara Brown Taylor says this: deep suffering makes theologians of us all. The questions people ask about God in Sunday school rarely compare with the questions we ask while we are in the hospital. This goes for those sick in waiting rooms as well as those in actual beds. To spend one night in real pain is to discover depths of reality that are roped off while everything is going fine. Why me? Why now? Why this? And I'm guessing that if you've lived long enough, you've found yourself asking these questions before at some point. Wondering if God even cares, wondering where God is. It could be because of an unexpected diagnosis or a failed relationship or a miscarriage or a promotion you worked really hard for just to be passed over, or the untimely death of a loved one, or another school shooting, or another natural disaster heading your way. Deep suffering makes theologians of us all. And to be honest, I have been preparing this sermon for the last few weeks in the shadow of feeling God's absence. There was something that I was really certain was God's will for a very dear friend, and it did not come to pass, despite my begging God to intervene in her circumstances. And I have been left confused and heartbroken and kind of reeling, wrestling with a lot of these questions. I actually sent Stephen a text as I was preparing that was like, I'm looking for some psalms that talk about deep despair and questioning God's presence for the Esther sermon, and also myself. And so I give you Psalm 13. O Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day? How long will my enemy have the upper hand? This questioning of God, these feelings of despair, they are part of the human experience. And like many of you has probably asked before, and like I am asking now, What do we do? When God feels absent, how do we respond? Esther presents us with 3 actions taken in the face of unspeakable horror and uncertainty, when God feels far away and hope feels bleak. And 2 of them actually fall in next week's passage, so I won't spend a lot of time on them today, but they're worth mentioning briefly. First of all, we're invited to lament. When Mordecai hears of the decree to annihilate his people, he tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth, he puts ashes on his head, and he walks the street wailing. During the pandemic, an editor for Time magazine reached out to biblical scholar N.T. Wright and asked if he would just write a quick little answer to the pandemic from a Christian perspective in 700 words or less. And N.T. Wright said this: I basically said, there is no good Christian answer for this except lament. And the point about lament is that we're saying, hey, what's going on? This is not the way it should be. Do something. Is there any other response to crippling illness, or a city without power and water for weeks, or senseless acts of violence? God does not expect us to be robots. God welcomes our feelings. God wants our honesty. God is also heartbroken by these things. Second, as we'll see next week, we're invited into the action. We might not feel like we have much autonomy, but we must engage in the ways we can, the places we're situated, with the people around us. Mordecai admonishes Esther to take action, and though her life is on the line, she does whatever she can to save her people. We participate in the story. But we'll look at those things more next week. For now, we're going to look at another way to respond when you're confused and scared and disappointed and God seems far away. Remembering. I'm picking back up at the end of Psalm 13. After raging and lamenting and questioning God, how long will you forget me? The psalmist ends with this: but I trust your unfailing love. I will rejoice because you have rescued me. I will sing to the Lord because he has been so good to me. I will rejoice because you have rescued me. The psalmist remembers God's love, times God showed up. The psalmist and the book of Esther is reminding us not to forget in the darkness what God has shown us in the light. It's the truth we cling to, that God came through before and will come through again. Remember the word Purim, when the lots were cast, when we were wondering if the roll of the dice was random or divinely timed. That word, Purim, came to be the name for the Jewish festival that is still celebrated in remembrance of Esther and the deliverance of the Jewish people from this very threat. Spoiler, the Jewish people are saved. We'll discuss more about this deliverance in the coming weeks, but we can't understand the significance of this week's passage without mentioning it today. All of this matters. This Purim festival, this celebration of remembrance, this 8-week study on the book of Esther, because, as Rachel Held Evans put it, for centuries, the Bible's stories of deliverance have offered hope to the struggling. From enslaved African Americans who saw the promise of freedom in the story of the Exodus, to pioneering women in ministry who found affirmation in Mary Magdalene's role as apostle to the apostles, to poor rural Latin American farmers who resonated with Christ's declaration that he came to proclaim good news to the poor, to set the oppressed free, and developed a theology of liberation around that theme. God's preference for the underdog, for defending the defenseless, and championing the cause of the suffering is a biblical theme too common to ignore. So I asked some of my Jewish friends how they celebrate Purim, and they both separately joked that Purim is a perfect example of how you can sum up nearly every Jewish holiday with, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. They told me stories of rowdy celebrations with kids dressed up in costume, ranging from Queen Esther to Spider-Man. Special cookies shaped like Haman's hat. And they all go to temple and reenact dramatic performances, and apparently there is a lot of drinking. One of my friends told me that they're encouraged to drink until they can no longer tell the difference between good and evil. So, sounds like quite a party. But mostly, Purim is a celebration of life. It is about remembering Jewish survival, both in the Bible and throughout history. Another Jewish friend told me, we are very much still facing persecution today. Purim is a reminder to us that we need to stand up to hate and bigotry, not just towards us, but in all forms. And it's crucial during their celebrations to retell the story. Reenactments and readings are part of the celebration because they help Jews to remember, to pass the stories on to their children. And this Jewish holiday is significant for Christians because of the idea of deliverance. From beginning to end, God appears in the Bible as a deliverer. Esther's story is just another link in the chain that points us towards Jesus and our ultimate story of redemption and rescue in him. It's an example of a time when God delivered God's people and a prophetic nod toward the ultimate deliverance. Biblical commentator Carol Bechtel frames it this way. When a Christian congregation responds to a reading from Esther, we are doing more than celebrating someone else's deliverance. We are celebrating our own. This is not to minimize what the book of Esther means to Jews or to Christians who care about Jews. In a world familiar with the Holocaust, not to mention newscasts full of stories about contemporary genocides, we dare not ignore Haman's modern manifestations, even in ourselves, nor neglect to celebrate God's victory over them. Yet we cannot help but recall the deliverance at the heart of our faith, Jesus Christ's victory over sin and death. In summary, then, Christians can learn much from the Jewish experience of the book of Esther. And deliverance stories are important because they help us to remember what is good and true and beautiful, even when all evidence points to the contrary. When all seems lost, when we can't see the way forward, sometimes the only response is to look back and remember the moments that God did show up. God often works in small, seemingly random ways, and it's only in hindsight that we can see God's fingerprints on a circumstance or situation. So what are some of these moments in your own lives? The cross-country move that resulted in you meeting your spouse. The job interview that you got because you happened to be sitting next to the CEO of the company at a wedding. Time you were late to drop off your kids and someone else was late and you guys got to talking and became good friends. The book that sat on your shelf for years until you picked it up at just the right time and it spoke truth into your circumstances. That fertility treatment that finally worked. Coincidence? Maybe. God? Maybe. These moments might seem small, but there's great power in naming our stories and connecting them with a bigger one. Rachel Held Evans says this: every time we retell stories of God's faithfulness in the past, whether around a candlelit Seder table or under a bright red and white striped revival tent, we are reminded that if God can make a way for Moses and the Hebrew slaves, for Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, for the grandma living on Social Security, for the alcoholic marking 20 years sober, then maybe God can make a way for me too. Storytelling has always been and always will be one of humanity's greatest tools for survival. So we tell our stories, and this is why at All Souls we spend a lot of time showing you guys those videos, telling the stories of grace and reconciliation and contribution. Because when I hear how Jim and Leslie have learned to rest, or how Rob got involved in SCS, or how Claudia donated bags of clothes during the Simplicity study, I'm reminded of how God is working in small and beautiful ways. So, when the dark nights come and we don't have easy answers to hard questions, may we remember and retell our own stories of redemption. May the Purim Festival and the Book of Esther remind us of our own deliverance. May we hold to the promise that God determines the roll of the dice. And may we continue to trust in God's unfailing love and sing to the Lord who has been so, so good to us. Amen.